So the discussion becomes then, when is Laylatul Qadr? Multiple opinions, as you can imagine. There's one opinion from Ikramah where he said it was the 15th of Sha'ban. And this is, of course, wrong because Allah Azza wa Jalla said, شَهْرُ رَمَضَانَ الَّذِي أُنزِلَ فِيهِ الْقُرْآنِ, right? And إِنَّا أَنزَلْنَاهُ فِي لَيْلَةِ الْقَدْرِ. So it has to be in Ramadan. You have the opinion of Imam bin Hazm, rahimahullah ta'ala, who mentions it in the beginning of the first 10, so the 20th or the 21st. You have the opinion of Abu Sa'id al-Khudri and Ibn Abbas, radiyallahu anhuma, the early opinion that mentions it as the 23rd night of Ramadan. You have an opinion of Ibn Umar, radiyallahu anhuma, that's the 24th or the 25th night of Ramadan. And then you have the opinion of Ubay ibn Ka'ab, the later opinion of Ibn Abbas, and many other scholars who say that it's the 27th night of Ramadan. And they have their evidences for that. And then you have other scholars who say that every year it changes to a different night, with it being more likely in the odd nights. Again, we have an article that goes through all of these opinions and how they were justified. And Imam al-Nawawi, rahimahullah ta'ala, he mentions in his commentary of the hadith of Sahih Muslim that this is the best way to harmonize the hadith, is that it can change from year to year. That it could be on the 23rd one year, and then it could be on the 25th the next year, it could be the 27th the year after that. So it moves within the last 10 nights of Ramadan. That is the opinion of a great majority, or not a great majority, but of many of the scholars of Islam. And it's the one that allows us to strive most throughout the last 10 nights. There's a weak narration that if an odd night coincides with Laylatul Jum'ah, and I mention this because we hear it every year, with the night of Friday, which would technically be Thursday night, then that's more likely to be Laylatul Qadr. Imam bin Rajab rahimahullah mentions this in Lata'if al-Ma'arif, but there isn't a solid proof of this. So could it be that because the night of Friday, which is a blessed night, if it coincides with an odd night of Ramadan, that it's that? Allahu A'lam. It could indeed be that there's a greater likelihood, but still, are you going to miss out on the other nights as a result of it? Imam al-Razi rahimahullah ta'ala, he says that Allah did not tell you when Laylatul Qadr is, or it was not conveyed to us through the Prophet ﷺ, because He didn't want people to fall into sin. Because if you knew what exact night it was and you missed it, then think about how sinful you would be. Like if you knew it was one night of the year and you still didn't worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on that night, then think about how sinful you would be. Now there is this narration where Abu Salama radiallahu ta'ala anhu says that انطلقت إلى أبي سعيد الخدري radiallahu ta'ala anhu. I went to Abu Sa'id radiallahu ta'ala anhu and I said, will you not go out and take a walk with us in the garden so that we can talk to you? So he came out and I asked him, what have you heard from the Prophet ﷺ about Laylatul Qadr? And he said that the Prophet ﷺ made i'tikaf for the first 10 nights of Ramadan. This is really interesting. And then Jibreel alayhi salam came to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam and he said to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, Inna ladhi tatlubu amamak, that which you are seeking is still ahead of you. So the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam stood up on the 10th and he said sallallahu alayhi wasallam that Jibreel alayhi salam came to me and he told me that which is or sought is still ahead of you. So we stayed with the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam for another 10. And then on the 20th, Jibreel alayhi salam came to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam and he said to him again, Inna ladhi tatlubu amamak, that verily that which you seek is still ahead of you. So the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that on the 20th of Ramadan. He said, Man kana i'takafa ma'a nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam falyarji', whoever was doing i'tikaf with the Prophet ﷺ, come back to the masjid. And he says, فَإِنِّي أُرِيتُ Laylatul Qadr. He said, I saw Laylatul Qadr, وَإِنِّي نُسِيتُهَا. I was caused to forget the exact night. And he said, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, that it is fil ashr al-awakhir, it is from the last 10. And he said, وَفِي witrin, and it is one of the odd of the last 10. And he said, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, وَإِنِّي رَأَيْتُ كَأَنِّي أَسْجُدُ فِي طِينٍ وَمَاءٍ. I see myself as if I'm making sujood in mud and in water. So basically that whatever that night's going to be in the last 10, I saw a vision of what it looks like, a dream, that I'm making sujood in mud and in water. And it was that year that on the 23rd night, there was rain, and it was a beautiful rain. And subhanAllah, there was no trace, Abu Sa'id radiallahu anhu says, there was no trace of clouds in the sky. And then suddenly, a cloud came right over us. And I remember this, subhanAllah, in 2019, in Hajj, that year in Arafah. It was so hot, and then suddenly, like this cloud just came right over Arafah, and started to rain over us. So he said, suddenly a cloud came out, and it rained over us. and the prayer was established, and the Prophet ﷺ prostrated in mud and water, and you could see it on his nose and his forehead, and that was the 23rd night. And there are other Sahaba that also document the same incident, such as Abdullah ibn Unais in a narration in Sahih Muslim. So, last 10 odd nights. Side note, the scholars say Surah Al-Qadr has 5 ayat, and Laylatul Qadr therefore is on 5 possible nights. So it's on an odd night of the 5 odd nights, according to some scholars who looked at it in that way. In another narration from Ibn Abbas radiallahu ta'ala anhuma, the Prophet ﷺ said, "Iltamisuha fil ashr al-awakhir," that seek it in the last 10 nights. But the Prophet ﷺ said that it is fi tasi'atin tabqa. It is in the it is when 9 nights remain, or when 7 nights remain, or when 5 nights remain. Some of the scholars took this, very interestingly. They said, therefore, the odd nights would not really be known until the end of the month, because if you're looking backwards, right, when 9 nights remain of Ramadan, or 7 nights remain of Ramadan, or 5 nights remain of Ramadan, you're not really going to know that until Ramadan is over. Right, so they said that there's actually something very interesting. You'd have to look at the hadith backwards in this regard. Of course, that's a minor opinion because the Prophet ﷺ is teaching us to seek, and so therefore you're looking from this way. But it gives some greater perspective to really pay attention to the even nights, because the even nights might in fact be odd. There's also the narration from Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha where she mentioned, Ya Rasulullah, if I see that it's Laylatul Qadr, if I'm in a night that's Laylatul Qadr, what dua should I make? And the Prophet ﷺ taught her to make a dua for the entire last 10 nights. And surely, if the Prophet ﷺ knew which night it was, he would have told her, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In another narration, the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that he had the night, but he was made to forget it when he saw the companions arguing, that it was lifted from him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so you think about moon fighting, and you think about the arguments that happen in the masajid, and all of these other things. SubhanAllah, an argument caused it to be lost. In any case, it was taken from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in terms of the exact date, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam would worship for all of the last 10, including the even nights. Some of the scholars also mentioned that one of the wisdoms of praying the even nights as well, is al-ihtiyat, that it could be in case of naqs al-hilal, in case of the moon sighting having been wrong. And subhanAllah, especially in these days where you have so many different methods and sometimes you have chaos in the determination of the beginning of Ramadan, are you sure that your odd night is actually an odd night, right? And I think for most of us, we would say that it's probably not a good idea to take that type of a risk. Now, is there any wisdom, or is there anything to point to specifying it later on? Ibn Umar radiallahu anhuma mentions that some of the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they saw a dream of Laylatul Qadr in the last week of Ramadan. In the last week of Ramadan. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, I see that your dreams agree regarding the last week. So whoever wants to seek Laylatul Qadr, then seek it in the last week, which means look for it in the last 7 nights. Now, was he talking about that year, or was he talking about in general, sallallahu alaihi wasallam? There's also the narration, Abu al-Khair says that As-Sanabihi asked me, when did you migrate? And Abu al-Khair said, we went out from Yemen as migrants and we arrived in Al-Juhfa. And then there came a rider whom I asked about the news, and the rider said, we buried the Prophet ﷺ 5 days ago. I asked As-Sanabihi, did you hear anything about Laylatul Qadr? He said, Bilal, the mu'adhin of the Prophet ﷺ, informed me that it is one of the 7 nights of the last 10 of Ramadan. And that hadith is in Al-Bukhari. Let's start with the opinion that's the 23rd. Remember that incident that took place where the Prophet ﷺ, had the mud on his face? Well, that turned out to be the 23rd. Abdullah ibn Unais radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he narrates that I was present at the gathering of Banu Salima, and I was the youngest of them. And the people said, who will ask the Prophet ﷺ for us about Laylatul Qadr? And this was on the 21st of Ramadan. So I went out and I prayed Maghrib alongside the Prophet ﷺ, and then I stood at the door of his house. He passed by me and he said to come in. I entered his house, and then the food was brought. When the Prophet ﷺ finished his food, he stood up and I stood up with him. And the Prophet ﷺ said, كَأَنَّ لَكَ حَاجَةً, perhaps you have some need of me. And I said, yes, O Rasulullah, some of the people of Banu Salima asked me to ask you about Laylatul Qadr. So the Prophet ﷺ said, كَمِ اللَّيْلَةِ, which night is tonight? So I said the 22nd. So the Prophet ﷺ said, Hiya Layla, that it's tonight. And then the Prophet ﷺ withdrew, and then the Prophet ﷺ turned around and he said, Awil Qabila, or it may be the following night, which could be the 23rd night. SubhanAllah, very interesting hadith. And the implication is, don't get too comfortable and worship on all of the last nights. But that taken with the incident from Abu Sa'id, in which indeed that year it seems that Laylatul Qadr was on the 23rd night, indicates that the 23rd night does have something to it. Now, there are far more narrations that indicate the 27th in particular, and this is a great group of the ulama who believed in the 27th night, holding particular significance. And this starts with Ubay ibn Ka'b, radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, who is one of the imams of the Sahaba of the Quran. He is the one who was leading Salatul Tarawih, that Umar radiyallahu anhu gathered the people behind in Salah for Salatul Tarawih. So imagine when this man swears, radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, that Laylatul Qadr is on the 27th night. And it was said to him, your brother, Ibn Mas'ud, radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, says that whoever stands for the night prayer throughout the year would catch Laylatul Qadr. And he said, rahimahullah, may Allah have mercy on him. He said that because he didn't want people to just rely on their worship for one night. Basically, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was saying, if you want to catch Laylatul Qadr, worship Allah every night of the year. But he's saying that he knew that it was on the 27th night, and he took an oath. He swore by Allah that it was the 27th night. And I said to him, Ya Aba Mundhir, who's Ubay ibn Ka'b, on what basis do you say that? And he said, by the sign in which the Prophet ﷺ gave us, that it is on the day that the sun would rise without having any ray in it. So again, in his mind, he was saying that, Ibn Mas'ud didn't want people to get too comfortable, but we, the companions, know that it is the 27th night of Ramadan. There's also a narration from Muawiyah, one that's attributed to the Prophet ﷺ in Sunan Abi Dawood, and more likely, more authentic to him, mawquf to him, where the Prophet ﷺ is saying, or he is saying, Laylatul Qadri, Laylatu Sab'in wa Ashreen, that Laylatul Qadr is the night of the 27th. It doesn't get as clear as that. Now, Ibn Hajar rahimahullah has over 40 statements of the ulama debating which one is the night of Laylatul Qadr, and he also says that this saying is most likely of Muawiyah radiallahu anhu and not the saying of the Prophet ﷺ himself, especially considering that Muawiyah himself has a narration in which he says, seek it until the very last night. So why would he contradict himself if he believed it to be only exclusively on the 27th night? Now, there's another question here is, well, did the Prophet ﷺ in any observable way worship differently on the 27th night? And there's a narration from Nu'aym ibn Ziyad that I heard in Nu'man ibn Bashir radiallahu ta'ala anhu on the minbar in Hims in Syria. And he said that we prayed Qiyam with the Prophet ﷺ during Ramadan on the night of the 23rd until 1/3 of the night had passed. And then we prayed Qiyam with him on the night of the 25th and 1/2 of the night had passed. And then we prayed Qiyam with him on the night of the 27th until we thought that we were going to miss Al-Falah, which is As-Suhur. Meaning we prayed the entire night on the 27th night. So clearly, at least for that year, the Prophet ﷺ did worship longer on the 27th night. There's also another authentic narration about an old man who says to the Prophet ﷺ that he's sick and he can't worship every night. And he said, which night should I push myself most? And the Prophet ﷺ said, alayka bis-sabi'a, focus on the 7th of the last 10. How do we reconcile all of these ahadith? There's a strong possibility that it is indeed on the 27th. And there is a strong possibility that it is on the 23rd, if you look at 27th to 23rd. But what we know is that it is on one of the last odd nights, and that you don't actually know which of the nights are odd. So you have to worship every single one of those last 10 as if it is that night. Now, there's still wisdom, though, in that old man talking to the Prophet ﷺ. If you have circumstances where you can only push yourself, let's say you can only take off of work for 5 of the 10 nights, or 3 of the 10 nights, then yes, you can prioritize the 27th to 23rd. But otherwise, push yourself throughout the last 10, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And there's just one thing that I want you to focus on. The Prophet ﷺ, when he said about him being made to forget Laylatul Qadr, he said, وَعَسَىٰ أَن يَكُونَ خَيْرًا لَكُمْ, that it may be better for you that it has been taken away. What that means is that, think about all of the tawbah, all of the ibadah in those other 9 nights. right? How beautiful is that? It might be on one of those 9 nights that you have your sincere tawbah with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and coming back to Allah azza wa jal. And so it's good for us to be on our toes. It's good for us to continue to seek bidnillahi ta'ala.